While you might find a few things in my videos cringy, that doesn't make picking on the creators of stuff on my shows okay. As tempting as it is to rage at or insult them, it does more harm than good in the end, especially since it can drive people to self-harm and or suicide. Please pick your battles wisely. That means don't harass any of the creators of anything featured in my shows, cause cyberbullying's bad, okay?
Hey guys, what is up? This is GothCat bringing you another episode of Totally Overrated as we finally get close to the series finale. I was kind of hoping to do my season 2 finale of the Crappy Pasta show on Halloween, but given what's been happening in my life, it's not gonna happen, so probably gonna go for ending my immortal on Halloween instead. Before we begin, I'd like to thank you for 161 subscribers we have come so far these past 2 years. Yeah, it's actually been 2 years since I started this channel. But from my portfolio channel days with like 28 subscribers and that huge subscriber loss, it's this channel is definitely growing, and it's nothing too big, it's still something to have at least a little bit of pride in. So thank you. As for today's story, we're going to be reading a story called Gateway of the Mind. The one where they get rid of this one guy's senses and hijinks happen. Yeah, that's basically. Yes, I believe this is completely overrated and does not deserve the acclaim that it gets. You'll see why at the end of this narration. Now, without further ado, enjoy the show, guys. In 1983, a team of deeply pious scientists conducted a radical experiment in an undisclosed facility. The scientists had theorized that a human without access to any senses or ways to perceive stimuli would be able to perceive the presence of God. They believed that the five senses clouded our awareness of eternity, and without them, a human could actually establish contact with God by thought. An elderly man who claimed to have nothing left to live for was the only test subject to volunteer. To purge him of all his senses, the scientists performed a complex operation in which every sensory nerve connection to the brain was surgically severed. Although the test subject retained full muscular function, he could not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel. With no possible way to communicate with or even sense the outside world, he was alone with his thoughts. Scientists monitored him as he spoke aloud about his state of mind in jumbled, slurred sentences that he couldn't even hear. After 4 days, the man claimed to be hearing hushed, unintelligible voices in his head. Assuming it was an onset of psychosis, the scientists paid little attention to the man's concerns. 2 days later, the man cried that he could hear his dead wife speaking with him, and even more, he could communicate back. The scientists were intrigued, but were not convinced until the subject started naming dead relatives of the scientists. He repeated personal information to the scientists that only their dead spouses and parents would have known. At this point, a sizable portion of scientists left the study. After a week of conversing with the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became distressed, saying the voices were overwhelming. In every waking moment, his consciousness was bombarded by hundreds of voices that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against the wall, trying to elicit a pain response. He begged the scientists for sedatives so he could escape the voices by sleeping. This tactic worked for 3 days, until he started having severe night terrors. The subject repeatedly said that he could not see and hear the deceased, and that he could see and hear the deceased in his dreams. Only a day later, the subject began to scream and claw at his non-functional eyes, hoping to sense something in the physical world. The hysterical subject now said the voices of the dead were deafening and hostile, speaking of hell and the end of the world. At one point he yelled, "No heaven, no forgiveness," for 5 hours straight. He continually begged to be killed, but the scientists were convinced that he was close to establishing contact with God. After another day, the subject could no longer form coherent sentences. Seemingly mad, he started to bite off chunks of flesh from his arm. The scientists rushed into the test chamber and restrained him to a table so he could not kill himself. After a few hours of being tied down, the subject halted his struggling and screaming. He stared blankly at the ceiling as teardrops silently streaked across his face. For 2 weeks, the subject had to be manually rehydrated due to the constant crying. Eventually, he turned his head and, despite his blindness, made focused eye contact with the scientist for the first time in the study. He whispered, "I have spoken with God, and he has abandoned us," and his vital signs stopped. There was no apparent cause of death. Okay, before I tell you my thoughts on this, only read a little footnote that's on the bottom. Follow-up study 2000, Dr. G.F. Department of Neurology, hospital name withheld, San Francisco, California. Recent study of a degenerative disease which targets the motor function and cognitive decline often leads to hallucinations of the deceased. The death of targeted cells and chemicals in the brain by this disease leads to a loss of smell, among other senses. The cause of this disease is unknown. Hallucinations present in 39.8% of the patients, falling into 3 categories: a sensation of a presence, person, a sideways passage, commonly of an animal, or illusions, present in 25.5% of patients, and isolated occurrence in 14.3%, formed visual hallucinations present in 22%, isolated 9.3%, and auditory hallucinations present in 9.7%, isolated in 2.3%. Continuing study in San Francisco, California, 2003 to present. Well, this is interesting. It's not quite. I don't think there's necessarily a connection between this study and whatever shit is presented in Gateway of the Mind. Okay, here are my problems with this story. First off, it seems to be more common for scientists to not be religious, either be non-religious or flat-out atheists. You know, Stephen Hawking being one of the more well-known of said scientists, and basically, if you're religious and you're a scientist, you're bound to stand out like a sore thumb, and it's kind of weird for an entire team of religious scientists to do the study in the first place. Second of all, the story kind of makes it look like it's simple to sever all the senses. I mean, you can easily sever senses like sight and hearing, but touch is probably the most going to be the most difficult to get rid of without flat out paralyzing the guy. You know, it's like there are so many touch nerves, and I don't know of a single nerve that goes to the brain that gives information on touch. I think that's directly given by the spinal cord. If you've studied anatomy and and you can prove me wrong, please let me know in the comments below. And thirdly, it doesn't have much detail to it. I mean, I don't know what would happen if somebody lost all their senses, but this thing just seems completely ridiculous. And apparently these scientists are so fixated on making contact with God that they're not even slightly nervous. At least there's no indication that any of the scientists were even slightly nervous. Well, except for the one sentence where a bunch of scientists left the study because this man was giving weirdly accurate details about them in his senseless state, pun intended. But otherwise, they just seem cold, calculating, and basically they're just basically your stereotypical scientist characters. They're cold and calculating with no emotions. Not really sure what else to say about this. Looking in the comments in the creepypasta wiki page, most of the reviews are definitely positive. Although there are also a few negative reviews, which means I'm not the only one that thinks this is a bit overrated. Although one comment seems to make zero sense. There's this comment by Mike MacD that says, "Makes no sense for several reasons, such as if he can't hear or feel, he can't speak intelligibly, and if he has no senses, he can't stand up, let alone throw himself against the wall. Never mind the silly concept of sever all senses and magic happens. Another idiotic pasta popularized by people with no standards." I only agree with a lot of sense on that one. I'm pretty sure if you lose a sense, you still retain skills that have to do with that sense to an extent. Like if you lose your hearing, but you are able to speak clearly, you'd probably still be able to speak to an extent. You just couldn't hear yourself. And of course, several other commenters shoot those reasons down. Not that I think this boss is any good. Let's see. Oh, and this comment. This story could have done a little bit better, but other than that, I don't have much to gripe about. 6 out of 10. I think 6 out of 10 is a little bit high there. Oh, another comment. How would this work? If the man had his nerves and such damage to the point he couldn't communicate, then why can he later speak somewhat in sentences? Again, the reasons are shot down. I think what people should be questioning is how senses can be surgically severed, how all the senses can be surgically severed in the first place. Especially touch. Alright. Let's see if... Oh, and there's at least one person that's called it underrated. Yeah. Yep, but overall, the comments are mostly positive for the shitty, bare bones story. I'm pretty sure some of you might disagree with me, at least if you actually see this video. Like I said, I mean, this needs a lot of changes to actually be functional as a story. Okay, I don't think I have anything else to say about this. Alright, next time on Totally Overrated, I'll be reading the infamous story Play With Me with Sally, who has been aged by her creator to fuck other creepypasta characters. Yeah. This should be interesting. Oh, this is Gothcat signing out. Thank you and goodbye.